Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Beyond Labels. I'm your co-host, Dr. Sina McCullough, and I'm here with our favorite farmer, Joel Salatin. Today's episode is actually really exciting because today we're talking about a Supreme Court decision that was brought down on Friday, June 28th, and it overturned a 40-year precedent called the Chevron Deference. Now, I know this already sounds super boring, but I promise you, this may be one of the most important decisions that the Supreme Court has made in my lifetime that's going to impact all of us. So the Chevron deference was really a precedent that made it easier for the federal government to actually regulate the environment, public health, workplace safety, our food supply. And they were able to do that through the federal agencies, the bureaucracy, as we call it, like the FDA, USDA, and EPA. So this Chevron decision essentially said that federal agencies like the FDA should be allowed to fill in the details when laws are not crystal clear. So, for example, if Congress passes a law and then the federal agency like the FDA is tasked with enacting that law, the public servants in the FDA would put together regulations to implement that law. But if Congress wasn't clear about what they were authorizing those public servants to do, like the specific regulations that they were then going to impose, for example, then the courts would have to defer to those bureaucracies or those federal agencies to interpret the law in terms of how to implement it. Okay. So it's like,
so just so everybody's with us here. For example, the Clean Water Act, that was a watershed act under, I think, Richard Nixon, the Clean Water Act, which, talked about, which gave the EPA power over, water. And it said navigable waters, and that was in the law. Well, what's happened is the EPA has determined that if you can put a child's paper boat in a puddle, that's a navigable water. And so that's what we're talking about here. Is for 40 years we've seen this incredible, well, attorneys call it overreach of what Congress passed and the president signed, but then once the agencies get done with it, they just keep pushing farther and farther. The intervention goes farther and farther and farther.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And so what we see happening is that these federal agencies were given that authority by Congress, right? And you and I have talked about this before. For instance, with the bioengineered food law that was passed by Congress, they basically handed it over to the secretary, right, to come up with the actual regulations of how to implement that law, right? So Congress has been kind of handing over, in my opinion, some of their power to these bureaucratic agencies, which are not accountable by the public, by the American citizens, because we don't vote for the people in the bureaucracies. Those are under the executive branch, right? So in essence, what we have is these bureaucracies have essentially been, in a way, writing laws, right? Even though constitutionally, Congress is supposed to write the laws. And this is another reason why the bureaucracy is sometimes referred to as the fourth branch of government, because it's like they are writing these things into law and they put them in the federal registries and they become the rule of the land. And so what happened is that has all now changed, right? In a case that was brought by New England fishermen, the Supreme Court has reversed this Chevron decision. So in doing so, the Supreme Court now is basically taking back judicial power by saying that it is the job of the courts to actually interpret the laws. It is not the job of the federal agencies like the FDA, USDA, or EPA. And that's how the government in the United States was actually originally set up, right? The courts are supposed to be the ones that are interpreting the laws, not the bureaucrats. So for me, this is kind of the beginning of a return to our founding, And Joel, I should mention this decision was 6-3. It was led by the 6 conservative justices. The liberal justices were in dissent. As I mentioned, this was brought about by the New England fishermen. So this is another example of what we would call this overreach by this fourth branch of government, the bureaucracy. There were basically regulations passed that were requiring these fishermen to have inspectors on their boats. So basically, it was a government program where they had to have these inspectors on the boats, but it wasn't funded by Congress. So the government agency said, well, the fishermen are going to have to pay for having these inspectors on their boats. And it was like $700 a day. This, in essence, was a tax that was passed, that was applied to these fishermen, right? So under the Chevron decision, if the fishermen sued, the court would have to actually defer to the experts in the government bureaucracy who wrote that law instead of the court interpreting the law for itself, right? So now the court doesn't actually have to defer. It can actually interpret these laws for itself. And there's a spokesperson for this fisheries organization that said that this was a huge win because now, quote, citizens have the same legal rights in court as the U.S. government does. She said that citizens have a fighting chance against government regulations that they think are unjust or constitutional, that a citizen can now start winning cases in not just the Supreme Court, but in district courts, because this decision applies to all courts, even the lower courts. So the fishermen did win this one. The Supreme Court did decide that this was not constitutional for them to pass this tax onto the fishermen, just because Congress didn't fund it. So this is a huge win for them, but this is a huge win for constitutionalists.
Yeah, well, we're people who understand the way our country was put together. The three branches of government were executive, legislative, and judicial. So executive was the president, legislative was Congress and the Senate, and judicial was the Supreme Court. Those were the final. That was the three, and they all of their powers were basically supposed to be balanced with each other. And a lot of people don't realize that when we say law or what is legal, only about maybe a quarter of that is actually passed by Congress. 75% is law that is written and enforced by the bureaucracy, the regulators, these, the EPA, FDA, USDA, and the problem with those is they're kind of not in any branch. You have Congress enabling them. Nixon, back at Nixon's time, they created the Environmental Protection Agency, for example, EPA. A lot of these agencies are relatively new. Franklin D. Roosevelt, of course, established numerous of them. We know that Teddy Roosevelt established the Food Safety Inspection Service, FSIS. But they kind of take on a life of their own because they write the law, they interpret the law, and they enforce the law. So what you have is as far as a citizen like you and I are concerned, when we run up against one of these agency rules, I'm not going to call it a law, I'm going to call it a rule.
Yeah.
Just so we separate from laws from Congress, what I would call legal laws.
That's correct.
Versus rules that are written and created by the bureaucracy, that aren't voted on by anybody.
Yeah, I tend to call them the regulations. Would that be technically correct? Yeah, there are more regulations because Congress is the only one that can actually pass laws.
That's correct. That's correct. And so, but what Congress does often is it it's what's called enabling legislation. So they pass enabling legislation that creates, for example, an agency, Homeland Security, okay, a TSA, all right, Transportation Safety Administration. They create this agency, and then they essentially let the agency write its own regulations.
Mm-hmm.
And if you and I, as a citizen, come up against those regulations, and we run afoul of them, for example, like we fail to wear a mask at the airport, then where do you appeal? The problem is when you start you appeal to a superior. Well, that's in the same agency. So they have an appellate process, but the process comes up through the agency, and you can't get, and if you go to court, the court defers, and here's where this Chevron case is so important, or where this new case is so important. The court then basically punts and says, well, whatever the agency says
That's right.
is the rule, and so you have no um, there's no fair appellate structure